Julian Crawford was a man everyone in the city knew. He was rich, powerful, and owned several hotels, restaurants, and real estate buildings. His face was often on magazines and TV shows. People called him the Golden Investor because everything he touched turned into success. But behind that polished smile and expensive tuxedos, there was a side of Julian no one truly knew. To the public, he was kind and generous. But in private, he had a short temper, especially with the one person who had raised him, his elderly mother, Mrs. Eleanor Crawford. Eleanor was a kind old lady in her 80s, with silver hair and soft blue eyes. She had worked hard to raise Julian after his father died when he was just 5. She worked 2 jobs, took night shifts, and even sold her wedding ring once to pay for his school fees. Everything she did was for him. But now, decades later, Julian treated her like an embarrassment. He thought she was slow, old-fashioned, and not someone he wanted to be seen with in public. She would call him every day just to ask how he was doing. He would ignore her. When she came to his house, he would let her wait outside for hours. And when she finally sat down at his fancy dinner parties, he would often speak to her like she was a child, or worse, a burden. One night, Julian threw a lavish party at his 5-star hotel restaurant. Celebrities, politicians, and businessmen filled the room. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Soft music played in the background, and the smell of rich food filled the air. Julian had invited his mother as a formality. He hadn't planned for her to actually come. But Eleanor showed up, wearing her best blue dress, a pearl necklace Julian had given her years ago, and a big smile. She was proud of her son, even if he didn't show her the same love anymore. As Eleanor took her seat next to Julian, she accidentally knocked over a glass of red wine with her elbow. It spilled across the white tablecloth, onto Julian's expensive suit, and even dripped onto the floor. The whole room turned silent for a moment. Everyone looked. Julian's face turned red, not from embarrassment, but from rage. Eleanor quickly tried to clean the mess, apologizing softly, but Julian slapped her hand away and stood up. "You embarrass me again," he hissed through clenched teeth, loud enough for half the room to hear. His hand came down sharply and hit her cheek. Not hard enough to injure, but enough to shock the entire room. Gasps echoed across the hall. The music stopped. The guests froze in their seats. Eleanor sat there, stunned, with tears forming in her eyes. Her old hands shook, not from fear, but from heartbreak. She had never imagined her son would humiliate her like this in front of everyone. Julian straightened his jacket and tried to act like nothing happened. He even forced a smile. "Sorry, folks. Just a little accident," he joked weakly. But nobody laughed. One man in particular didn't move or smile. He sat quietly in the back, in a black suit, watching everything. His eyes were fixed on Julian, and he had already made a quiet call from his phone under the table. Julian had no idea who this man was, or why he was paying such close attention. But he was about to find out, because that man was someone with more power than Julian could ever imagine. After the slap, the party never felt the same. Guests whispered among themselves. Some tried to return to their meals, while others made excuses to leave early. The atmosphere had gone cold. Julian, still pretending everything was fine, ordered his assistant to escort his mother out quietly. Eleanor, with watery eyes and a trembling voice, told the assistant she could walk out herself. She didn't look back. No one offered her help. No one stood up for her. Everyone was too scared of losing Julian's favor, or too used to turning their heads when the powerful acted cruelly. As Eleanor stepped outside into the cool night, a tear rolled down her cheek. She sat at the bus stop near the hotel, holding her small purse tightly in her lap. She didn't understand what had gone so wrong. She remembered the days when she would pack Julian's lunch for school, the time she sat beside him all night when he had a fever, and the way he used to hug her tight when he got scared. Where had that boy gone? When did he become a man who saw her as a problem? Inside the restaurant, Julian continued smiling at guests, but fewer people were talking to him. Many were still shaken by what they had seen. The man in the black suit, who had watched the whole thing silently, stood up and left quietly without speaking to anyone. His name was David Langston. He was a federal investigator, and not just any kind. He specialized in financial crimes and secret investigations involving large corporations and wealthy elites. He had been following Julian Crawford for months, gathering evidence of suspected tax evasion, money laundering, and illegal overseas accounts. But up until that night, David had doubts. Julian always managed to stay just outside the law's reach. But when David saw Julian slap his elderly mother in front of a room full of witnesses, he realized something important. Julian wasn't just arrogant, he was careless. People who feel untouchable often make mistakes, and that kind of public behavior could help push witnesses to speak. If Julian could hurt his own mother in front of everyone, who else might he have hurt when no one was watching? David made a decision that night. The investigation was going to speed up. Back at Eleanor's small apartment on the edge of town, she sat alone in silence. The pictures on her walls told a different story. A young Julian on his first day of school, Julian holding a spelling bee trophy, Julian smiling beside her at his college graduation. She touched one of the pictures gently and whispered, "What happened to you, my son?" Her heart ached not just from the slap, but from years of emotional distance. For so long, she had made excuses for him. She told herself he was busy, that he had big responsibilities, that he still cared deep down. But tonight had made things painfully clear. Eleanor didn't know that someone else cared. Someone who had seen everything and wasn't going to let it slide. David had already made some calls. By the next morning, a quiet investigation that had stayed in the shadows for over a year would now have new life. Hidden documents, financial records, former employees who were once afraid to speak. All of it was about to come out. Julian had stepped too far, not just morally, but legally. And while he thought slapping his mother was just a moment of anger quickly forgotten, it had lit a fire in the heart of a man with the power to bring his entire empire crashing down. Julian, still unaware of what was building behind the scenes, continued with his usual routine. He spent the next day making business calls, holding meetings, and posting photos online of his successful night at the party. But the comments were different this time. Instead of praise, there were questions. A few guests had quietly shared what they'd seen. A video had started to spread, one that showed the moment Julian slapped his mother. It was grainy but clear enough, and people were angry. The public, who once admired him, now started asking, what kind of man does that to his own mother? Julian had no idea that his fall had already begun. The video of the incident spread quickly across social media. At first, Julian ignored it, thinking it would blow over like most scandals. He believed his name was too big, his influence too strong, and his money too deep for anything to affect him. But this time, something felt different. More people were watching. The public reaction was growing worse each hour. People were commenting furiously online, sharing their own stories of parents being mistreated by their children, and calling Julian a disgrace. A few small news outlets picked it up, showing the clip, and asking questions about the kind of man Julian really was behind the camera lights. Even people in his business circle began to act differently. His restaurant partners postponed meetings. One sponsor withdrew from a major hotel launch. Employees started to whisper more openly. But Julian still tried to hold on. He called his PR team and demanded they release a statement saying it was all a misunderstanding. They tried to soften the story by saying Eleanor had tripped, and Julian was simply helping her steady herself. But the public didn't believe it. The video clearly showed what had happened. And worse, someone had spoken to the press anonymously, a former employee of Julian's mother who used to work in her apartment as a cleaner. The cleaner shared that Julian hadn't visited his mother in over 2 years. He had stopped supporting her financially, even though he had promised to take care of her after his success. Eleanor had been living on a small pension and occasional charity from local neighbors. That information made people angrier. Julian, who wore gold watches and dined in luxury restaurants, couldn't even provide basic help to the woman who gave up everything for him. The story reached national headlines. Meanwhile, David Langston's investigation gained momentum. The slap had done more than start a public outcry. It had created an opening for people to speak. Former employees of Julian's companies began coming forward. A former accountant admitted she had been forced to sign fake tax documents. A hotel manager said he had seen cash transactions disappear without records. A supplier shared how Julian threatened him to stay quiet about an illegal shipment. David's office collected statements, bank records, and copies of offshore transfers. What was once a thin case now became a thick file of evidence. Julian's lawyers were now busy. One of them came to him nervously and said, "There's talk of a federal case. We might need to prepare for court." Julian slammed his hand on the desk and shouted, "This is all because of that stupid old woman." His voice echoed in the room. He didn't know that one of his assistants, who had always felt sorry for Eleanor, was recording him from behind the hallway door. That assistant would soon hand the recording over to David as further proof of Julian's true character. While Julian panicked and tried to save his public image, Eleanor stayed quiet. She didn't respond to the media. She didn't give interviews. But when a young journalist came to her door asking for a comment, she gently said, "I only ever wanted my son to be kind." That simple sentence was printed across magazines and newspapers. It touched millions of hearts. People from across the country wrote letters to her, thanking her for her strength and courage. Donations came pouring in to help support her. A local church organized meals and services to make sure she never felt alone again. Julian tried one last move. He appeared on television and gave a fake apology. He sat in a suit, looked into the camera, and said he regretted his actions and loved his mother deeply. But it was too late. His words felt cold and forced. People didn't believe him anymore. His brand deals were canceled. 2 major investors pulled out, and his stock value dropped overnight. What had taken Julian 10 years to build was crumbling in a matter of days. And still, he didn't understand that the real damage wasn't just from the slap. It was from everything that came before it. The lies, the cruelty, the selfishness, and the way he treated the person who had loved him most. Within 2 weeks, Julian Crawford's world had completely changed. The man who had once walked through hotels with pride, surrounded by admirers and reporters, was now avoiding public places and refusing to answer his phone. Lawsuits began piling up. Federal agents raided his main office and one of his private estates, seizing documents and computer equipment. News vans parked outside his properties. Former business partners distanced themselves, and employees resigned in waves. His face was no longer seen in glossy business magazines, but on news broadcasts discussing fraud, corruption, and disgrace. His empire was falling apart. Julian, once confident and untouchable, now sat in a dark corner of his mansion, watching the news alone. His staff had left. His house, though big and beautiful, was cold and silent. For the first time, he felt the weight of isolation. He tried calling some of his friends, but most didn't answer. The few who did offered polite excuses or short conversations before hanging up. He finally realized that many of those friendships were never real. They had been based on money, power, and the illusion of success. Now that all of that was disappearing, so were the people he thought cared about him. The hardest moment came when Julian was officially charged with several crimes. He was taken in by federal officers in front of flashing cameras. The same media outlets that once praised his sharp mind and genius strategies now called him a disgraced millionaire and a symbol of corporate greed. He was released on bail, but his court dates were set. He would have to answer for everything: tax fraud, bribery, illegal business deals, and the mistreatment of workers. And though the charges were heavy, what hit Julian the hardest was something simpler: the complete loss of public respect. At the same time, Eleanor's life began to change in a very different way. The community rallied around her. She was moved to a nicer home provided by a local charity organization. Volunteers helped her settle in, brought her meals, and kept her company. She received letters from strangers, some from other elderly parents who had faced the same kind of loneliness and disrespect from their children. She read every note and kept them in a small wooden box by her bed. They reminded her that kindness still existed in the world, even when it didn't come from her own son. Eleanor never once said a bad word about Julian. When asked about the court cases and the media storm, she would only say, "I pray he finds his way again." Her quiet dignity moved many people. A popular journalist wrote, "In a world full of noise, Eleanor Crawford's silence speaks the loudest." Some people even started a foundation in her name to support elderly parents who were abandoned or mistreated by their families. Eleanor didn't ask for any of it. She simply wanted to live peacefully, without anger, without bitterness. Julian was given a choice by his legal team: make a public apology in court and cooperate with the investigation, or risk a long trial and serious prison time. He chose to cooperate. On the day of his court hearing, he stood in front of a judge, wearing a plain suit. His face looked tired, and his usual charm had vanished. He gave a statement, not just about his crimes, but about his treatment of his mother. For the first time in public, he said, "What I did to my mother was not just wrong, it was shameful. I failed her as a son." But by then, most people had already made up their minds about him. After the hearing, Julian requested to visit Eleanor. With some hesitation, she agreed. He came to her new home, holding nothing but a small bouquet of white flowers. She opened the door slowly. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Julian, with tears in his eyes, said, "I don't know how to fix what I've done, Mom, but I'm sorry." Eleanor didn't say anything right away. She just nodded and stepped aside to let him in. They sat together in silence for a long time. No lawyers, no cameras, no fancy dinner tables. Just a mother and a son, sitting side by side after years of distance, and one unforgettable moment that had changed everything. Though forgiveness wouldn't erase the past, it marked the beginning. Julian would still face the law. He would lose much of what he once had. But that evening, sitting with the woman who had given him everything, he started to feel something he hadn't in a very long time: humility. And perhaps, for the first time in his adult life, a glimpse of true peace.